His corvette had not even felt the great tempests, which by sweeping away the groups of clouds on the Rocky Mountains, had allowed them to observe the course of the famous projectile. Everything went well, and with all the fervor of a Presbyterian, he did not forget to thank heaven for it. The series of soundings taken by the Susquehanna had for its aim the finding of a favorable spot for the laying of a submarine cable to connect the Hawaiian Islands with the coast of America. It was a great undertaking, due to the instigation of a powerful company. Its managing director, the intelligent Cyrus Field, proposed even covering all the islands of Oceanica with a vast electrical network, an immense enterprise, and one worthy of American genius. To the corvette Susquehanna had been confided the first operations of sounding. It was on the night of the 11th-12th of December. She was in exactly to 77 north latitude and 4137 west longitude on the meridian of Washington. The moon, then in her last quarter, was beginning to rise above the horizon. After the departure of Captain Blomsberry, the lieutenant and some officers were standing together on the poop on the appearance of the moon. Their thoughts turned to that orb, which the eyes of a whole hemisphere were contemplating. The best naval glasses could not have discovered the projectile wandering around its hemisphere, and yet all were pointed toward that brilliant disk which millions of eyes were looking at the same moment. "They have been gone 10 days, said Lieutenant Bronsfield at last. "What has become of them?" "They have arrived, Lieutenant," exclaimed a young midshipman, "and they are doing what all travelers do when they arrive in a new country, taking a walk." "Oh, I am sure of that, if you tell me so, my young friend," said Lieutenant Bronsfield, smiling. "But," continued another officer, "their arrival cannot be doubted. The projectile was to reach the moon when full on the 5th at midnight. We are now at the 11th of December, which makes 6 days, and in 6 times 24 hours, without darkness, one would have time to settle comfortably. I fancy I see my brave countrymen encamped at the bottom of some valley on the borders of a selenite stream, near a projectile half buried by its fall amid volcanic rubbish, Captain Nicholl beginning his leveling operations, President Barbicane writing out his notes, and Michel Ardan embalming the lunar solitudes with the perfume of his—" "Yes, it must be so, it is so," exclaimed the young midshipman, worked up to a pitch of enthusiasm by this ideal description of his superior officer. "I should like to believe it," replied the lieutenant, who was quite unmoved. "Unfortunately, direct news from the lunar world is still wanting." "Beg pardon, Lieutenant," said the midshipman, "but cannot President Barbicane write?" A burst of laughter greeted this answer. "No letters," continued the young man quickly. "The postal administration has something to see to there." "Might it not be the telegraphic service that is at fault?" asked one of the officers ironically. "Not necessarily," replied the midshipman, not at all confused, "but it is very easy to set up a graphic communication with the Earth." "And how?" "By means of the telescope at Long's Peak. You know it brings the moon to within 4 miles of the Rocky Mountains, and that it shows objects on its surface of only 9 feet in diameter. Very well. Let our industrious friends construct a giant alphabet. Let them write words 3 fathoms long, and sentences 3 miles long, and then they can send us news of themselves." The young midshipman, who had a certain amount of imagination, was loudly applauded. Lieutenant Bronsfield allowing that the idea was possible, but observing that, if by these means, they could receive news from the lunar world, They could not send any from the terrestrial unless the Selenites had instruments fit for taking distant observations at their disposal. Evidently, said one of the officers. But what has become of the travelers, what they have done, what they have seen, that above all must interest us. Besides, if the experiment has succeeded, which I do not doubt, they will try it again. The Columbiad is still sunk in the soil of Florida. It is now only a question of powder and shot. And every time the moon is at her zenith, a cargo of visitors may be sent to her. It is clear, replied Lieutenant Bronsfield, that J.T. Maston will one day join his friends. If he will have me, cried the midshipman, I am ready. Oh, volunteers will not be wanting, answered Bronsfield. And if it were allowed, half of the Earth's inhabitants would emigrate to the moon. This conversation between the officers of the Susquehanna was kept up until nearly 1 in the morning. We cannot say what blundering systems were broached, what inconsistent theories advanced by these bold spirits. Since Barbicane's attempt, nothing seemed impossible to the Americans. They had already designed an expedition, not only of savants, but of a whole colony toward the Selenite borders, and a complete army, consisting of infantry, artillery, and cavalry, to conquer the lunar world. At 1 in the morning, the hauling in of the sounding line was not yet completed. 1,670 fathoms were still out, which would entail some hours' work. According to the commander's orders, the fires had been lighted and steam was being got up. The Susquehanna could have started that very instant. At that moment, it was 17 minutes past 1 in the morning. Lieutenant Bronsfield was preparing to leave the watch and return to his cabin, when his attention was attracted by a distant hissing noise. His comrades and himself first thought that this hissing was caused by the letting off of steam. But lifting their heads, they found that the noise was produced in the highest regions of the air. They had not time to question each other before the hissing became frightfully intense. And suddenly, there appeared to their dazzled eyes an enormous meteor, ignited by the rapidity of its course and its friction through the atmospheric strata. This fiery mass grew larger to their eyes and fell, with the noise of thunder, upon the bowsprit, which it smashed close to the stem, and buried itself in the waves with a deafening roar. A few feet nearer, and the Susquehanna would have foundered with all on board. At this instant Captain Bloomsbury appeared, half-dressed, and rushing on to the forecastle deck, whither all the officers had hurried, exclaimed, with your permission, gentlemen, what has happened? And the midshipman, making himself as it were the echo of the body, cried, Commander, it is they come back again. Chapter 21. J.T. Maston recalled, It is they come back again. The young midshipman had said, and every one had understood him, no one doubted, but that the meteor was the projectile of the gun club. As to the travelers which it enclosed, opinions were divided regarding their fate. They are dead, said one. They are alive, said another. The crater is deep, and the shock was deadened. But they must have wanted air, continued a third speaker. They must have died of suffocation. Burned, replied a fourth. The projectile was nothing but an incandescent mass as it crossed the atmosphere. What does it matter? They exclaimed unanimously. Living or dead, we must pull them out. But Captain Bloomsbury had assembled his officers, and with their permission, was holding a council. They must decide upon something to be done immediately. The more hasty ones were for fishing up the projectile, a difficult operation, though not an impossible one, but the corvette had no proper machinery, which must be both fixed and powerful. So it was resolved that they should put in at the nearest port, and give information to the gun club of the projectile's fall. This determination was unanimous. The choice of the port had to be discussed. The neighboring coast had no anchorage on 27 latitude. Higher up above the peninsula of Monterey stands the important town from which it takes its name. But, seated on the borders of a perfect desert, it was not connected with the interior by a network of telegraphic wires, and electricity alone could spread these important news fast enough. Some degrees above opened the Bay of San Francisco. Through the capital of the gold country, communication would be easy with the heart of the Union, and in less than 2 days the Susquehanna, by putting on high pressure, could arrive in that port. She must therefore start at once. The fires were made up, they could set off immediately. 2,000 fathoms of line were still out, which Captain Blomsberry, not wishing to lose precious time in hauling in, resolved to cut. "We will fasten the end to a buoy," said he, "and that buoy will show us the exact spot where the projectile fell." "Besides," replied Lieutenant Bronsfield, "we have our situation exact 27.7 north latitude, and for 137 west longitude." "Well, Mr. Bronsfield," replied the captain, "now, with your permission, we will have the line cut." A strong buoy, strengthened by a couple of spars, was thrown into the ocean. The end of the rope was carefully lashed to it, and, left solely to the rise and fall of the billows, the buoy would not sensibly deviate from the spot. At this moment the engineer sent to inform the captain that steam was up, and they could start, for which agreeable communication the captain thanked him. The course was then given north-northeast, and the corvette, Waring, steered at full steam direct for San Francisco. It was 3 in the morning. 450 miles to cross. It was nothing for a good vessel like the Susquehanna. In 36 hours, she had covered that distance. And on the 14th of December, at 27 minutes past 1 at night, she entered the Bay of San Francisco. At the sight of a ship of the National Navy, arriving at full speed, with her bowsprit broken, public curiosity was greatly roused. A dense crowd soon assembled on the quay, waiting for them to disembark. After casting anchor, Captain Blomsberry and Lieutenant Bronsfield entered an 8-paired cutter, which soon brought them to land. They jumped on to the quay. The telegraph, they asked, without answering one of the 1,000 questions addressed to them. The officer of the port conducted them to the telegraph office. Through a concourse of spectators, Blomsberry and Bronsfield entered, while the crowd crushed each other at the door. Some minutes later a 4-fold telegram was sent out, first to the Naval Secretary at Washington, the second to the Vice President of the Gun Club, Baltimore, the third to the Hon. J.T. Maston, Long's Peak, Rocky Mountains, and the fourth to the Subdirector of the Cambridge Observatory, Massachusetts. It was worded as follows: in 207 north latitude, and for 137 west longitude, on the 12th of December, at 17 minutes past 1 in the morning, the projectile of the Columbiad fell into the Pacific. Send instructions, Blomsberry, Commander, Susquehanna. 5 minutes afterward the whole town of San Francisco learned the news. Before 6 in the evening, the different states of the Union had heard the great catastrophe, and after midnight, by the cable, the whole of Europe knew the result of the great American experiment, we will not attempt to picture the effect produced on the entire world by that unexpected denouement. On receipt of the telegram, the naval secretary telegraphed to the Susquehanna to wait in the Bay of San Francisco without extinguishing her fires day and night. She must be ready to put to sea. The Cambridge Observatory called a special meeting, and, with that composure which distinguishes learned bodies in general, peacefully discussed the scientific bearings of the question. At the gun club there was an explosion. All the gunners were assembled. Vice President the Hon. Wilcome was in the act of reading the premature dispatch, in which J.T. Maston and Belfast announced that the projectile had just been seen in the gigantic reflector of Long's Peak, and also that it was held by lunar attraction, and was playing the part of under-satellite to the lunar world. We know the truth on that point. But on the arrival of Bloomsbury's dispatch, so decidedly contradicting J.T. Maston's telegram, two parties were formed in the bosom of the gun club. On one side were those who admitted the fall of the projectile, and consequently the return of the travelers. On the other, those who believed in the observations of Long's Peak concluded that the commander of the Susquehanna had made a mistake. To the latter, the pretended projectile was nothing but a meteor, a shooting globe, which in its fall had smashed the bows of the corvette. It was difficult to answer this argument, for the speed with which it was animated must have made observation very difficult. The commander of the Susquehanna and her officers might have made a mistake in all good faith. One argument, however, was in their favor, namely, that if the projectile had fallen on the earth, its place of meeting with the terrestrial globe could only take place on this 27 north latitude, and taking into consideration the time that had elapsed, and the rotary motion of the earth, between the 41 and the 42 of west longitude. In any case, it was decided in the gun club that Bloomsbury brothers, Bilsby, and Major Elphinstone should go straight to San Francisco and consult as to the means of raising the projectile from the depths of the ocean. These devoted men set off at once, and the railroad, which will soon cross the whole of Central America, took them as far as St. Louis, where the swift mail coaches awaited them, almost at the same moment in which the Secretary of Marine, the Vice President of the Gun Club, and the Subdirector of the Observatory received the dispatch from San Francisco. The Honorable J.T. Maston was undergoing the greatest excitement he had ever experienced in his life, an excitement which even the bursting of his pet gun, which had more than once nearly cost him his life, had not cost him. We may remember that the Secretary of the Gun Club had started soon after the projectile, and almost as quickly, for the station on Long's Peak in the Rocky Mountains. J. Belfast, director of the Cambridge Observatory, accompanying him, arrived there. The two friends had installed themselves at once, never quitting the summit of their enormous telescope. We know that this gigantic instrument had been set up according to the reflecting system, called by the English front view. This arrangement subjected all objects to but one reflection, making the view consequently much clearer. The result was that, when they were taking observation, J.T. Maston and Belfast were placed in the upper part of the instrument, and not in the lower, which they reached by a circular staircase, a masterpiece of lightness, while below them opened a metal well terminated by the metallic mirror, which measured 280 feet in depth. It was on a narrow platform, placed above the telescope, that the two savants passed their existence execrating the day, which hid the moon from their eyes, and the clouds which obstinately veiled her during the night. What then, was their delight when, after some days of waiting, on the night of the 5th of December, they saw the vehicle, which was bearing their friends into space. To this delight succeeded a great deception, when, trusting to a cursory observation, they launched their first telegram to the world, erroneously affirming that the projectile had become a satellite of the moon, gravitating in an immutable orbit. From that moment, it had never shown itself to their eyes. A disappearance, all the more easily explained, as it was then passing behind the moon's invisible disk. But when it was time for it to reappear on the visible disk, one may imagine the impatience of the fuming J.T. Maston and his not less impatient companion. Each minute of the night, they thought they saw the projectile once more, and they did not see it. Hence constant discussions and violent disputes between them, Belfast affirming that the projectile could not be seen, J.T. Maston maintaining that it had put his eyes out. "It is the projectile," repeated J.T. Maston. "No," answered Belfast, "it is an avalanche detached from a lunar mountain." "Well, we shall see it tomorrow." "No, we shall not see it any more, it is carried into space." "Yes." "No." And at these moments, when contradictions rained like hail, the well-known irritability of the secretary of the gun club constituted a permanent danger for the Honorable Belfast. The existence of these two together would soon have become impossible. But an unforeseen event cut short their everlasting discussions. During the night, from the 14th to the 15th of December, the two irreconcilable friends were busy observing the lunar disk, J.T. Maston abusing the learned Belfast as usual, who was by his side. The secretary of the gun club maintaining for the 1000th time that he had just seen the projectile, and adding that he could see Michel Ardan's face looking through one of the scuttles, at the same time enforcing his argument by a series of gestures, which his formidable hook rendered very unpleasant. At this moment Belfast's servant appeared on the platform. It was 10 at night, and gave him a dispatch. It was the commander of the Susquehanna's telegram. Belfast tore the envelope and read, and uttered a cry. "What?" said J.T. Maston. "The projectile, well, has fallen to the earth." Another cry. This time a perfect howl answered him. He turned toward J.T. Maston. The unfortunate man, imprudently leaning over the metal tube, had disappeared in the immense telescope, a fall of 280 feet. Belfast, dismayed, rushed to the orifice of the reflector. He breathed. J.T. Maston, caught by his metal hook, was holding on by one of the rings, which bound the telescope together, uttering fearful cries. Belfast called, help was brought, tackle was let down, and they hoisted up, not without some trouble, the imprudent secretary of the gun club. He reappeared at the upper orifice, without hurt. "Ah," said he, "if I had broken the mirror." "You would have paid for it," replied Belfast severely. "And that cursed projectile has fallen," asked J.T. Maston. "Into the Pacific. Let us go." A quarter of an hour after the two savants were descending the declivity of the Rocky Mountains, and 2 days after, at the same time as their friends of the gun club, they arrived at San Francisco, having killed 5 horses on the road. Elphinstone, the brothers Blomsbury, and Bilsby rushed toward them on their arrival. "What shall we do?" they exclaimed. "Fish up the projectile," replied J.T. Maston, "and the sooner the better." Chapter 22. Recovered FROMTHESEA. The spot where the projectile sank under the waves was exactly known. But the machinery to grasp it and bring it to the surface of the ocean was still wanting. It must first be invented, then made. American engineers could not be troubled with such trifles. The grappling irons once fixed, by their help, they were sure to raise it in spite of its weight, which was lessened by the density of the liquid in which it was plunged. But fishing up the projectile was not the only thing to be thought of. They must act promptly in the interest of the travelers. No one doubted that they were still living. Yes, repeated J.T. Maston incessantly, whose confidence gained over everybody. Our friends are clever people, and they cannot have fallen like simpletons. They are alive, quite alive. But we must make haste if we wish to find them so. Food and water do not trouble me. They have enough for a long while, but air, that is what they will soon want. So quick. And they did go quick. They fitted up the Susquehanna for her new destination. Her powerful machinery was brought to bear upon the hauling chains. The aluminum projectile only weighed 19,250 pounds, a weight very inferior to that of the transatlantic cable, which had been drawn up under similar conditions. The only difficulty was in fishing up a cylindro-conical projectile, the walls of which were so smooth as to offer no hold for the hooks. On that account engineer Murchison hastened to San Francisco and had some enormous grappling irons fixed on an automatic system, which would never let the projectile go if it once succeeded in seizing it in its powerful claws. Diving dresses were also prepared, which through this impervious covering allowed the divers to observe the bottom of the sea. He also had put on board an apparatus of compressed air, very cleverly designed. There were perfect chambers pierced with scuttles, which, with water let into certain compartments, could draw it down into great depths. These apparatuses were at San Francisco, where they had been used in the construction of a submarine breakwater. And very fortunately it was so, for there was no time to construct any. But in spite of the perfection of the machinery, in spite of the ingenuity of the savants entrusted with the use of them, the success of the operation was far from being certain. How great were the chances against them, the projectile being 20,000 feet under the water? And if even it was brought to the surface, how would the travelers have borne the terrible shock, which 20,000 feet of water had perhaps not sufficiently broken? At any rate, they must act quickly. J.T. Maston hurried the workmen day and night. He was ready to don the diving dress himself, or try the air apparatus, in order to reconnoiter the situation of his courageous friends. But in spite of all the diligence displayed in preparing the different engines, in spite of the considerable sum placed at the disposal of the gun club by the government of the Union, 5 long days, 5 centuries elapsed before the preparations were complete. During this time public opinion was excited to the highest pitch. Telegrams were exchanged incessantly throughout the entire world. By means of wires and electric cables, the saving of Barbicane, Nicole, and Michel Ardan was an international affair. Everyone who had subscribed to the gun club was directly interested in the welfare of the travelers. At length the hauling chains, the air chambers, and the automatic grappling irons were put on board. J.T. Maston, engineer, Murchison, and the delegates of the gun club were already in their cabins. They had but to start, which they did on the 21st of December at 8 o'clock at night, the corvette meeting with a beautiful sea, a northeasterly wind, and rather sharp cold. The whole population of San Francisco was gathered on the quay, greatly excited but silent, reserving their hurrahs for the return. Steam was fully up, and the screw of the Susquehanna carried them briskly out of the bay. It is needless to relate the conversations on board between the officers, sailors, and passengers. All these men had but one thought, all these hearts beat under the same emotion, while they were hastening to help them. What were Barbicane and his companions doing? What had become of them? Were they able to attempt any bold maneuver to regain their liberty? None could say. The truth is that every attempt must have failed. Immersed nearly 4 miles under the ocean, this metal prison defied every effort of its prisoners. On the 23rd inst. At 8 in the morning, after a rapid passage, the Susquehanna was due at the fatal spot. They must wait till 12 to take the reckoning exactly. The buoy to which the sounding line had been lashed had not yet been recognized. At 12, Captain Blomsberry, assisted by his officers, who superintended the observations, took the reckoning in the presence of the delegates of the gun club. Then there was a moment of anxiety. Her position decided, the Susquehanna was found to be some minutes westward of the spot where the projectile had disappeared beneath the waves. The ship's course was then changed, so as to reach this exact point. At 47 minutes past 12, they reached the buoy. It was in perfect condition, and must have shifted but little. At last, exclaimed J.T. Maston. Shall we begin? Asked Captain Blomsberry. Without losing a second, every precaution was taken to keep the corvette almost completely motionless. Before trying to seize the projectile, Engineer Murchison wanted to find its exact position at the bottom of the ocean. The submarine apparatus destined for this expedition was supplied with air. The working of these engines was not without danger, for at 20,000 feet below the surface of the water, and under such great pressure, they were exposed to fracture, the consequences of which would be dreadful. J.T. Maston, the brothers Blomsberry, and Engineer Murchison, without heeding these dangers, took their places in the air chamber. The commander posted on his bridge superintended the operation, ready to stop or haul in the chains on the slightest signal. The screw had been shipped, and the whole power of the machinery collected on the capstan would have quickly drawn the apparatus on board. The descent began at 25 minutes past 1 at night, and the chamber, drawn under by the reservoirs full of water, disappeared from the surface of the ocean. The emotion of the officers and sailors on board was now divided between the prisoners in the projectile and the prisoners in the submarine apparatus. As to the latter, they forgot themselves, and, glued to the windows of the scuttles, attentively watched the liquid mass through which they were passing. The descent was rapid. At 17 minutes past 2, J.T. Maston and his companions had reached the bottom of the Pacific, but they saw nothing but an arid desert, no longer animated by either fauna or flora. By the light of their lamps, furnished with powerful reflectors, they could see the dark beds of the ocean for a considerable extent of view, but the projectile was nowhere to be seen. The impatience of these bold divers cannot be described, and having an electrical communication with the corvette, they made a signal already agreed upon, and for the space of a mile the Susquehanna moved their chamber along some yards above the bottom.